Well, thanks so much for having us here today. It's really a privilege to get to talk about these incredibly important issues to this group. So we're going to talk about how the pandemic has affected learning and inequality. It's obvious that the pandemic has upended so much in our lives over the last 11 months. And here, we're going to try to use data from Zearn, and I'll say more about that in a moment, to measure the ways in which the pandemic has disrupted learning. For whom has it disrupted learning? We're going to try to measure the ways in which it's, in fact, exacerbated inequality in the American higher education system, and then try to use the data to suggest what we might be able to do about this. Before we get into the education, though, let me set the broader stage. This is part of a project that my colleagues and I at Opportunity Insights have put up called the Economic Tracker, where we can see how the pandemic is affecting not only education, but also many different aspects of the economy. And in that broader context, it's very clear to see how the pandemic is exacerbating inequality in the United States. So just to show you one graph, this plot shows relative employment levels for people at different points in the wage distribution over the past 12 months. And what you see is that for high income earners, those are in green, there was a very sharp shock in April where employment fell quite sharply, but then it also recovered very sharply, such that by the beginning of the summer in June or July, employment had entirely recovered to its pre-pandemic levels. You know, this was the classic V-shaped recession for high-income workers, and it stayed at that very high level over the last 7 months. For lower-income workers, in contrast, there was a much larger drop in employment in April last year, losing nearly 40% of jobs. And while there was speedy recovery through the first few months towards the beginning of the summer, the recovery stalled in July, and we've seen really no further recovery since then. If anything, things have been getting worse. And at the most recent date where we have data, which is in December, there are still more than 6 million low-wage jobs missing from the economy with no sign of recovery. And so this builds on the last 40 years where we've seen incomes at the top of the income distribution growing rapidly while the median wage has barely budged. And so for all the reasons that we were very concerned about economic inequality before the pandemic has, I think, made all of those concerns worse. And what that means is that we need to not only think about reversing this effect of the pandemic, but doing so in a way that fights the broader issues of inequality as well. You know, hopefully this might be a spur to that. So let me now turn to education and tell you a little bit about what I'm going to measure. So Zearn is an online math education app, which crucially is used as part of the weekly classroom ritual for teaching math in more than a quarter of elementary schools across the country. And so what that allows us to do is measure the extent to which students were using it and not just logging in, but making progress in Zearn in the pre-pandemic period. We'll measure that using what are called badges in the system, which are basically lessons that you have to complete in order to move forward. And again, a very important feature of Zearn is that you cannot pass through a lesson until you get to 100%. And so it may take some students longer, some students may do it more quickly, but the number of badges completed is a pretty good measure of not just engagement, but also learning. So we're going to focus on these classrooms that were already using Zearn. And then we're going to use school level data. So just to be very clear, these are not student level data, but we're looking at how these patterns are going to differ across different schools as measured by their demographic composition or their school type. And we've also measured from a data set from Burbio.com, whether schools are teaching entirely remotely, in person, or in a hybrid format since they reopened this school year. So let me show you what those patterns look like. We've split this by schools that are in the top 2 middle and bottom quartiles of the economic distribution as judged by the fraction of students receiving free and reduced price lunch. So what you see is that all these schools were kind of bouncing along before the pandemic hit. Usage is a little bit higher in some weeks than others. There's then a very steep fall off when everyone went remote in the middle of March. But the drop off for students at schools serving relatively high income students, those are the schools in the blue line, it only falls about 25. And then over the next month, it recovers so that by the time you get to the end of April, which is when we have to cut the data off because kind of usage at that point starts to fall off heading into the summer, they've entirely recovered back to the pre-pandemic level of usage. In contrast, the schools serving the most free and reduced price lunch students, those are in green, had a much steeper fall and then a slower recovery. So that almost similar to the labor market graph I showed you, by the time schools started shutting down for the summer, they were still 40% below the pre-pandemic levels of learning. Of course, I don't think that we can say from this graph that high-income students were not affected just because they got back to their pre-pandemic levels on Zearn. This is only one measure of what they're doing. But in many ways, it's probably the easiest thing for schools to get students to continue doing. And so I see this measure very much as a canary in the coal mine. If schools can't even get this back to baseline, it's not a good sign for what's going on with the rest of learning. So what happened then once schools came back from the summer? We saw again that high income schools were as if nothing happened. They were basically back to the pre-pandemic baseline with that big dip before the winter break is the Thanksgiving week. Whereas the good sign is low income and middle income schools are doing much better than they were doing before the summer, but still there are pretty large gaps. So for instance, low income schools, in the last week that we have on this chart at the end of January, they're down about 17% on their pre-pandemic level. And that's something that's been fairly consistent for the entire current school year. And so, even with that time to prepare over the summer, it seems that there are really significant disparities that continue to emerge in education. Now, this is a national plot, but there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity which we can show. So, for instance, this is a heat map by state, where states in blue are seeing on average higher levels of usage, states in red are seeing lower levels of usage. And there's some pretty clear patterns where students in New England and on the West Coast, Utah, Colorado, they seem to have done relatively better by this measure. Schools in the South especially seem to have not done so well. But even the state level variation doesn't capture all that we see in the data. There's a ton of local variation as well. So for instance, if you just take Louisiana, which is a quite red state at the state level, and we zoom in to the parish level or county level within that state, here you see most counties are deep red, but there are counties that are doing much better. So for instance, there's this cluster of counties in the southeast part of the state, which are right around New Orleans, which actually did seem to be doing quite a bit better. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Another key distinction that we see is that this combines schools regardless of whether they are remote or virtual during the current school year, but we see pretty large differences there too. So this graph here breaks out schools in the kind of turquoise that returned remotely in the fall, and then in the darker green are schools that taught in person in the fall. And what you see is that the schools that returned in person were actually doing quite a bit worse in the spring But then once they return, they actually jump basically back to the baseline. Whereas schools that continue to be remote, you see that growth in learning as the spring wore on last year. But then this year, they basically continued at a similar level, which is quite a bit, about 20% below baseline. And so, these schools often did kind of amazing things in order to grow back last spring. But it's clear that this remote learning continues to really limit student access and learning. And this is something also that is disproportionately affecting students from lower income backgrounds. So this is a nice split that Shalinee and her team produced. If you look on the left, what you see is that students in high poverty schools are doing much better when they are in person. Whereas on the right, you see it's actually the reverse. Students from higher income schools seem to actually be doing better when they are remote. And so I think, again, this just highlights the extent to which not only these broad patterns, but the remote aspect of schooling for many students this year is something that is disproportionately affecting students from lower income backgrounds. So I think overall, what these data suggest is that the most important thing we can do is, fix the pandemic and have students get back to school in a safe way. You might not have needed me here to tell you that, but what can we do in the meantime? What do the data suggest that we can do to really combat these issues? So I think the data suggest three things. And so I'm going to give you the first one, and Shalinee is going to kind of dive deeper into the data from an educator's perspective and give you the other two. So the first is that we can use the data to identify what I'll call positive deviant schools. These are schools which, despite teaching students that suffered, great problems and were incredibly affected by the pandemic, they seem to have really promoted learning. And so we've identified those schools in the data. And if you plot them, they're on the top here in purple, right? Not only did they experience, above pre-pandemic levels of Zearn usage last spring, but they've continued at those high levels even after coming back in the fall. So they're clearly doing something that's really getting students engaged. We actually spent some time talking with some of these students and schools, and what it really seems like mattered is it's about trying to think of the learning experience as more than just the material, trying to make sure that the students can deal with those other things in their life that can make things very challenging right now in order to kind of clear the way to get them to focus on the material. That in combination with just some extraordinary efforts by particular educators and teachers to get this going. And so, for instance, those few parishes in Louisiana, they basically, bucked what was a statewide pattern of kind of essentially not trying to get students or teachers to, force people to do anything, and really, I think, made an enormous difference both in the fall and in the spring. So let me now turn it over to Shalinee to talk about the final two ways to address these shortfalls.
Thanks, John. And before I dive in, I have to say that our team is simply astounded by the schools and districts that have performed so well during the pandemic, those that have bucked the trend. And we'll continue to study and look at these schools over time to see what we can learn. But looking forward, there are two really important lessons to think about as we recover learning that our data can help with. And so the first is really about creating extended time for students who have lost learning. What you saw in John's chart earlier was that low-income students missed time on Zearn for every single week of the pandemic, and high-income students barely missed any learning at all, or perhaps spent more time on Zearn. And so that time has to be made up somewhere. And what I'm really excited about is that in my conversations with states and districts, it looks like summer is on. And while last summer we sort of talked about as a country that we needed to get summer learning going, what we basically saw was that nothing happened. And I feel so hopeful right now because it looks like across the country, we are going to use this summer well for the kids who need it most. And what we'd say at Zearn and what John's chart would show is that we simply have to. It's going to be really important to make this summer count, and which is the summer of 21 as well as the summer of 22, and to use this time to make up for the missed learning. When we think about this extended time, be it tutoring, be it summer school, be it any forms we can use to extend time, it's going to be really important that we do the right math during that extended time. It's important to remember that in a normal course of events, which the pandemic is very much not, but in a normal course of events, our K-12 system is not great at catching up students once they fall behind. That's not a capability we have. And what we typically do when a student falls behind is we move into a remediation set of strategies in math that are focused on drilling and killing simple skills. And that is not how math works, and that's not what children need. What we can see in our data set across the 6 billion problems completed on our website is that as we move into summer, students need to be focused on the big ideas of math. And here I have a fourth grade example in front of you. And what we want fourth graders focused on this summer who are rising into fifth grade are two big ideas. We want them focused on multiplying and dividing big numbers with a rock solid understanding of base 10 underneath it and an understanding of equivalent fractions. And if this is what we spend our summer and extended time on, this is the path through seventh grade math, through algebra, through high school and through college. And so it's vital that we make sure that we don't fall into our instincts to drill and kill. The other instinct that we have in K-12 that will be quite harmful, and we can see happening in our data set, is what I would call over-remediation strategies. And so over-remediation also does not work. And so here I'd like to share some new research we're doing with Steve Levitt from UChicago, the author of Freakonomics. And we set out to investigate the effectiveness of different approaches taken this year, starting with last fall, on our web application to recover missed learning. So we wanted to see when children are over-remediated, what actually happens to them. And this is really important. The finding here is very important as districts, schools, states build their plans to recover missed learning. And what the chart shows is the rate of struggle on early fifth grade content for two groups of schools. Both of these sets of schools missed fourth grade content during the spring closures. And that fourth grade content is vital, it's decimals. And then both groups set off with these same fifth graders and got going with learning. One group, the purple line, did what we called a targeted remediation sequence. And this was a sequence we told them to do, which had a small amount of remediation that was just in time as students needed it. And the other group covered a great deal of fourth grade content before moving into fifth grade content. And what you can see is that the students that follow the blue line, they actually struggle more. So while our instinct might be that children need to back up and redo half a year of math, the actual experience of learning math like that is more confusing on a day-to-day basis for children, and they struggle more. And further, it affects their capacity with time to even get through all of fifth grade. In contrast, the purple line are the children who had that targeted remediation. They did just enough fourth grade math just in time. And what you can see is they struggle less. And what we can see now as they're progressing through the school year is these children will complete most of fifth grade content. And so these are the learnings so far from our data that provide you what John took you through, which was who's learning and who's not learning, and what we need to do to recover learning. And these last few insights show us some important mistakes that we should not make. One is that we must extend time. And the second is that as we extend that time, we must not over-remediate children. Thank you.